In the heart of a bustling city, where towering buildings stretched toward the sky and streets buzzed with endless activity, there was a man who seemed invisible to everyone around him. His name was Marcus Kane, though few people knew it or cared enough to ask. He sat quietly on a weathered park bench, his clothes worn but clean, his face lined with stories untold. To the world, he was just another homeless man trying to survive. But beneath that unassuming exterior lay a past so extraordinary that it could silence even the loudest room. Marcus wasn't always like this. Once upon a time, he had been one of the most respected figures in the U.S. military, a Green Beret sniper whose skill and precision were unmatched. Known for his ability to remain calm under pressure, he had completed missions others deemed impossible. From dense jungles to arid deserts, Marcus's rifle had saved countless lives while taking down some of the most dangerous enemies of his country. Yet, despite all his achievements, something inside him broke after years of relentless combat. The weight of loss, the comrades he couldn't save, the horrors he witnessed, became too much to bear. When his service ended, instead of returning to a hero's welcome, Marcus chose solitude. He disappeared into the shadows of civilian life, leaving behind medals, accolades, and memories alike. Now he lived simply, carrying only what fit into a small duffel bag. Inside it were fragments of his old life, an old photograph showing him in full uniform, standing proudly alongside his team, a pair of dog tags engraved with his name, and a journal filled with notes he never intended to share. These items weren't treasures. They were reminders of who he used to be, tucked away like ghosts from another lifetime. Every day blended into the next for Marcus. He spent hours sitting on the same park bench, watching people rush by without noticing him. Some days, children would play nearby, their laughter echoing through the air. Other times, businessmen hurried past, glued to their phones, oblivious to everything around them. Marcus didn't mind being overlooked. In fact, he preferred it. Being invisible meant no questions, no judgments, and no expectations. It gave him peace, a rare commodity in his chaotic existence. But today felt different. As dusk settled over the city, casting long shadows across the pavement, two police officers approached the park. They moved with purpose, their boots clicking against the concrete. Marcus noticed them immediately, not because they stood out, but because he had trained himself to observe every detail. Years of survival instincts kicked in as he watched them scan the area, their eyes eventually landing on him. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Marcus felt the faint stirrings of unease. Something about their body language told him this encounter wouldn't end well. Still, he remained seated, his expression calm, betraying nothing of the storm brewing inside. The officers stopped a few feet away, their presence commanding attention. One of them spoke first, his voice sharp and demanding. "Hey you, what are you doing here?" Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he looked up slowly, meeting the officer's gaze with steady eyes. "Just resting," he replied evenly, his tone devoid of emotion. But his simple answer did little to satisfy the men. If anything, it made them more suspicious. Little did they know, the man before them was far more than he appeared, and their actions were about to awaken a part of him that had lain dormant for years. The two police officers stood over Marcus, their postures rigid and authoritative. The taller of the two, Officer Daniels, crossed his arms and frowned. "Resting," he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "This isn't your property. You can't just sit here whenever you feel like it." His partner, Officer Grayson, nodded in agreement, though his eyes darted around nervously, as if expecting trouble to erupt at any moment. To them, Marcus was just another homeless man, someone who didn't belong, someone they could push around without consequence. Marcus didn't argue. He had learned long ago that explanations rarely mattered to people like these officers. Instead, he simply replied, "I'm not causing any harm." His voice was calm, almost too calm, which seemed to irritate Daniels even more. "That's not for you to decide. Daniel shot back, taking a step closer. "We're the ones who enforce the rules around here. Now show us some ID." Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching into his pocket. He pulled out an old, faded driver's license and handed it over. Daniel snatched it from him, squinting at the details under the dim streetlight. "Marcus Kane," he read aloud, smirking slightly. "And what exactly do you do, Mr. Kane? Besides loitering, I mean." His tone carried a mocking edge, as though he already knew, or assumed, he wouldn't like the answer. Before Marcus could respond, Grayson chimed in, pointing toward the duffel bag resting beside him. "What's in there?" he demanded, his hand instinctively moving toward the baton on his belt. Marcus glanced at the bag, then back at the officers. "Just personal belongings," he said evenly. But his nonchalant demeanor only fueled their suspicion further. Daniels gestured sharply at the bag. "Open it up. Let's see." When Marcus didn't move immediately, Grayson stepped forward and grabbed the bag himself. "Hey," Marcus protested, his voice firmer this time. "You can't just go through my things without reason." "Oh, we've got plenty of reasons," Daniels retorted, sneering. "Loitering, refusing to cooperate. Need I go on?" As Grayson unzipped the bag, Daniels leaned in, clearly eager to find something incriminating. Inside, they found nothing but a few basic items: a worn-out blanket, a water bottle, the photograph of Marcus in uniform, and his dog tags. Grayson held up the photo, scrutinizing it closely. "What's this? Some kind of costume party prop?" Marcus clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. "It's not a costume," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made both officers pause for a split second. "I served in the military." Daniels let out a derisive laugh. "Yeah, right. And I'm the President of the United States." He tossed the photo aside carelessly, earning a sharp glare from Marcus. For a brief moment, the air between them grew tense, charged with unspoken hostility. But Marcus forced himself to stay still, reminding himself that reacting would only make things worse. Grayson, meanwhile, picked up the dog tags and examined them curiously. "Looks real enough," he muttered, showing them to Daniels. "Maybe he actually did serve." Daniels rolled his eyes. "So what? Even if he did, look at him now, a washed-up vet living on the streets. Pathetic." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut, though he didn't let it show. He'd heard insults like these before, but coming from men who wore badges, the very symbols of justice and protection, it stung more than usual. As the officers continued rifling through his belongings, their attitude shifted from suspicion to outright disdain. They mocked his appearance, questioned his sanity, and accused him of lying about his past. Each word chipped away at Marcus's composure, though he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him crack. Deep down, however, a part of him stirred, a part that hadn't been awakened in years. It was the same part that had once allowed him to remain calm under fire, to calculate every move with precision, and to strike decisively when the moment called for it. When Daniel shoved Marcus against the nearby wall, claiming he was resisting compliance, something inside him snapped, but not in the way the officers expected. Instead of lashing out or raising his voice, Marcus slipped into a state of hyper-awareness. Every movement, every sound, became crystal clear. The officers were so focused on asserting dominance that they failed to notice the subtle shift in Marcus's demeanor. What they saw as weakness was, in fact, the calm before the storm, and soon they would realize just how wrong they had been. As Daniels pushed Marcus against the wall, his hand pressing firmly on Marcus's shoulder, he felt a strange sense of unease. For someone who had just been manhandled, Marcus didn't react the way most people would. There was no flinch, no struggle, no angry retort, just an eerie stillness that made Daniels hesitate for a fraction of a second. But arrogance quickly overrode his instincts. "You better start cooperating," Daniels growled, tightening his grip, "or this is gonna get worse for you." Grayson stood nearby, holding Marcus's dog tags in one hand and glancing nervously between his partner and the man pinned to the wall. Something about the situation felt off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Marcus's calm demeanor was unsettling, almost unnatural. Most people in his position would have shouted, pleaded, or tried to break free. But Marcus, he didn't even blink. Without warning, Marcus spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that silenced both officers momentarily. Daniel scoffed, trying to mask his discomfort with bravado. "Oh yeah, and who exactly are we dealing with?" He sneered, leaning closer. "Some homeless guy with a sob story." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes locked onto Daniel's, unwavering and piercing. It was as if he were looking straight through the officer, reading every insecurity, every doubt hidden beneath the uniform. Then, in a single fluid motion, Marcus shifted his stance ever so slightly. To anyone watching, it might have looked like nothing more than a casual adjustment. But Grayson noticed something odd. Daniels's grip, which had been firm just moments ago, suddenly loosened. Before either officer could process what was happening, Marcus twisted his body with precision, using Daniels' own momentum against him. In less than a heartbeat, Daniels found himself stumbling forward, off balance and confused. Grayson froze, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. His training screamed at him to act, but something held him back, a gut feeling that this wasn't an ordinary confrontation. By the time Daniels regained his footing, Marcus had already turned his attention to Grayson. With the same calculated ease, he disarmed the younger officer, plucking the baton from Grayson's belt as if it were child's play. Both weapons, the baton and Daniels's flashlight, clattered harmlessly to the ground before either man could react. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, yet it left the officers stunned. They stared at Marcus, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. How had this seemingly harmless man moved so quickly, so effortlessly? And why did he now exude an aura of quiet authority that made them feel like the ones being interrogated? Marcus stood between them, his posture relaxed but alert. He didn't raise his voice or threaten them. Instead, he let the silence speak for itself. When he finally broke it, his tone was measured, almost clinical. "I've faced far worse than the two of you," he said calmly. "Men who thought they were untouchable, men who underestimated me because of how I looked or where I came from. You think your badges make you invincible. Let me tell you something. They don't." Daniels opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he truly saw the man standing before him, not the disheveled figure on the park bench, but someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Grayson, meanwhile, took an involuntary step back, clutching his empty holster as if searching for reassurance. Marcus bent down slowly and picked up the discarded weapons, handing them back to the officers without a trace of malice. "Take these," he said simply, "and remember this moment the next time you decide to judge someone based on appearances." As the gravity of the situation sank in, Daniels and Grayson exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever they had expected when they approached Marcus earlier, this was not it. And deep down, they knew their lives and careers might never be the same again. The air was thick with tension as Marcus stood between the two officers, his presence commanding yet eerily calm. Daniels and Grayson were frozen in place, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. They clutched their weapons awkwardly, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified that Marcus hadn't used them against them. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the faint rustling of leaves in the cool night breeze. Finally, Daniels broke the silence, his voice shaky but defiant. "What do you want from us?" he demanded, trying to sound authoritative despite the fear creeping into his tone. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step back, giving the officer space while maintaining eye contact. His gaze was steady, almost unnerving, as if he were studying them, not as threats, but as lessons waiting to be taught. "I don't want anything from you," Marcus replied, his voice low and deliberate. "But maybe you need something from me." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "You came here thinking I was just another faceless person, someone beneath you because of where I sleep or what I wear. But let me ask you this. What makes you better than me? Is it your badge, your uniform, or is it something else?" Grayson shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Daniels for guidance, but his partner seemed equally lost. Neither of them had expected this turn of events. What started as a routine stop had spiraled into something far more profound and unsettling. Marcus stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "I've seen men like you before," he said, his tone carrying the weight of experience. "Men who hide behind power because they're afraid of what happens when it's stripped away. Men who judge others without knowing their stories, assuming they're superior simply because they wear a title." Daniels frowned, bristling at the accusation. "We're not hiding behind anything," he snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're doing our job." "Your job," Marcus countered, raising an eyebrow. "Is your job to harass people who can't fight back? To treat someone like trash because they don't look like you or live like you? Tell me, Officer Daniels, how many lives have you saved today? How many sacrifices have you made for strangers who will never even know your name?" The questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Grayson looked down, avoiding Marcus's piercing gaze, while Daniels clenched his fists, struggling to find a retort. The truth was, they hadn't thought about any of this when they approached Marcus earlier. All they saw was a homeless man. A statistic, a nuisance. They hadn't considered the possibility that he might carry scars deeper than the ones visible on his weathered skin. Marcus softened slightly, his tone shifting from confrontational to reflective. "When I wore a uniform, it wasn't for show. It wasn't about power or authority. It was about service, about protecting people, even those who couldn't protect themselves. And yes, sometimes it meant making hard choices, facing dangers most people couldn't imagine. But every decision I made, every action I took, was for a purpose greater than myself." He gestured toward the park bench where he'd been sitting moments ago. "Now look at me. You see a homeless man. But what if I told you I've walked through war zones, stared death in the face, and come out alive? What if I told you I've done things that would haunt you for the rest of your life, all in the name of duty? Would that change how you treat someone like me?" Daniels opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Was he really the protector he claimed to be, or was he just another bully masquerading as a hero? Grayson, meanwhile, looked visibly shaken, his earlier skepticism replaced by guilt. Marcus didn't wait for a response. He turned away, leaving the officers standing there, grappling with the weight of his words. As he walked back to his bench, he muttered one final remark over his shoulder. "Power isn't about control. It's about responsibility. Remember that the next time you decide to judge someone based on what you think you know." And with that, Marcus sat down, picking up his duffel bag as if nothing had happened. But for Daniels and Grayson, everything had changed. Their assumptions, their arrogance, their sense of invincibility, it had all been shattered in the span of a single encounter. Word of the incident spread quickly within the police department, though not in the way Daniels and Grayson might have hoped. The two officers returned to the precinct shaken, their earlier bravado replaced by a mix of embarrassment and dread. They tried to downplay what had happened, brushing it off as a routine misunderstanding that got slightly out of hand. But rumors have a way of traveling fast, especially when they involve something as unusual as a homeless man disarming two armed officers without breaking a sweat. It didn't take long for their superiors to catch wind of the story. At first, higher-ranking officials dismissed it as exaggeration. Surely, no one could be that skilled, right? But curiosity eventually got the better of them. A senior detective decided to dig deeper, pulling up whatever information he could find on Marcus Kane. What he uncovered left the entire department stunned. Marcus's military records confirmed everything he had hinted at during his encounter with the officers, and then some. He wasn't just any soldier, he was a legend. A Green Beret sniper with a record number of confirmed kills under extreme conditions. Marcus had been part of missions so classified that even seasoned investigators struggled to access full details. His name was mentioned in briefings reserved for top brass, and his reputation among those who served alongside him bordered on mythical. Yet here he was, living unnoticed on the streets, reduced to invisibility by a society that had forgotten its heroes. The revelation sent shockwaves through the precinct. Senior leadership scrambled to contain the fallout, knowing full well how damaging the story could be if it reached the public. Harassing a decorated war veteran, it was a PR nightmare waiting to happen. Behind closed doors, heated discussions unfolded about how to handle the situation. Some argued for damage control, issuing a formal apology and sweeping the incident under the rug. Others pushed for disciplinary action against Daniels and Grayson, fearing that leniency would only invite further scrutiny. Meanwhile, Marcus remained blissfully unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the chaos brewing around him. Life went on as usual for him. Quiet days spent on his park bench, observing the world go by, and nights curled up in whatever shelter he could find. If anything, the incident seemed to reinforce his decision to stay out of the spotlight. He hadn't sought recognition or revenge. He simply wanted to live in peace. But peace, it turned out, wasn't meant to last. A local journalist named Clara Hayes, known for her investigative pieces on police misconduct, caught wind of the story. Intrigued by the whispers circulating online, she began digging into Marcus's past. Through interviews with retired military personnel and carefully obtained documents, Clara pieced together a narrative that painted Marcus not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience and integrity. Her expose highlighted not only the injustice he faced, but also the broader issue of how veterans were often neglected after sacrificing so much for their country. When the article hit the front page of the city's largest newspaper, it ignited a firestorm. Readers were outraged, not just at the treatment Marcus endured, but at the systemic failures that allowed such incidents to occur. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #ForgottenHeroes, drawing attention to the plight of homeless veterans across the nation. Calls poured into the police department demanding accountability, while advocacy groups rallied behind Marcus, offering support and resources. Faced with mounting pressure, the police chief held a press conference to issue a public apology. Standing before cameras and reporters, he expressed regret for the officers' actions and promised reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. Daniels and Grayson were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, though many felt the punishment was too lenient given the circumstances. As for Marcus, he watched the unfolding drama from afar, uninterested in becoming the center of attention. When approached by Clara for an interview, he politely declined, explaining that he didn't want to relive the past or fuel more conflict. Still, he couldn't ignore the wave of goodwill that followed the article's publication. Strangers began visiting him at the park, thanking him for his service and offering help. Local businesses donated meals, clothing, and other essentials. For the first time in years, Marcus found himself surrounded by kindness rather than indifference. Though he never sought it, Marcus's quiet dignity inspired countless others. People started seeing him not as a homeless man, but as a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who served. The attention surrounding Marcus Kane only grew after Clara Hayes' expose hit the headlines. What started as a local story quickly gained national traction, capturing the hearts of people across the country. News outlets picked up the narrative, framing Marcus not just as a victim of injustice, but as a symbol of resilience and quiet strength. His name became synonymous with the broader conversation about how society treats its veterans, those who gave everything only to be left behind. For Marcus, however, the sudden spotlight was overwhelming. He had spent years avoiding recognition, choosing instead to live in obscurity. Now, strangers approached him daily, some offering help, others seeking inspiration, and a few simply wanting to shake his hand. While their intentions were kind, Marcus struggled to adjust to the newfound attention. The park bench that once offered him solitude now felt like a stage, and he wasn't sure he wanted to play the role everyone expected of him. Despite his discomfort, Marcus couldn't deny the impact his story was having. Veterans advocacy groups reached out, inviting him to speak at events aimed at raising awareness for homeless service members. At first, he declined, insisting he wasn't the right person for such a responsibility. But eventually, one invitation stood out, a gathering of young soldiers preparing to transition back into civilian life. The organizer explained that hearing from someone like Marcus could make a difference, helping them navigate the challenges ahead without losing hope. Reluctantly, Marcus agreed. On the day of the event, he stood backstage, gripping the edges of the podium with a mix of nerves and resolve. As he stepped into the spotlight, the room fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him, many filled with admiration, others with curiosity. For a moment, Marcus hesitated, unsure where to begin. Then he took a deep breath and spoke. "I'm not here to tell you my story because I think it's special," he began, his voice steady but warm. "I'm here because I know what it's like to feel invisible, to carry burdens no one else can see. When I came home, I thought I'd left the hardest part of my life behind me. But the truth is, the battle doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Sometimes, it follows you everywhere." He paused, scanning the crowd. "You've all sacrificed so much, your time, your safety, your peace of mind, for a cause bigger than yourselves. And yet, when you return, the world doesn't always understand what you've been through. People see the uniform, but they don't see the scars. They see the hero, but they don't see the human being underneath." Marcus went on to share pieces of his journey. The pain of losing friends, the struggle to adapt to civilian life, and the loneliness of feeling forgotten. He didn't sugarcoat anything. His words were raw and honest, resonating deeply with everyone in the room. When he spoke about the night he encountered the officers, he framed it not as a moment of triumph, but as a lesson. "That night wasn't about proving a point or showing off skills I learned in the military," he said. "It was about reminding two men, and maybe myself, that we're all capable of better. That power isn't about control, it's about responsibility." By the time Marcus finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Many attendees rose to their feet, moved by his humility and wisdom. Afterward, dozens lined up to thank him personally, sharing their own stories of struggle and hope. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a sense of purpose, not as a sniper or a soldier, but as someone who could guide others through the darkness. In the weeks that followed, opportunities poured in. Job offers arrived from companies eager to hire a veteran of his caliber. Housing assistance programs extended invitations to provide him with stable living arrangements. Even the police department reached out, asking if he'd consider working with them to train officers on sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Though hesitant at first, Marcus eventually embraced these chances, seeing them as ways to give back rather than seek personal gain. Through it all, Marcus remained grounded. He never sought fame or fortune, nor did he let the accolades define him. Instead, he used his platform to advocate for those still struggling. Veterans sleeping on park benches, families torn apart by war, communities grappling with loss. In doing so, he reminded the world that true heroes aren't defined by medals or titles, but by the quiet acts of courage and compassion they perform every day. And while Marcus continued to visit his old park bench from time to time, he now did so knowing he had reclaimed his place, not as a forgotten shadow, but as a beacon of hope for anyone willing to listen. Marcus Kane's life had come full circle, though not in the way anyone might have predicted. The man who once chose invisibility now found himself at the center of a movement, a quiet force for change that rippled far beyond his small corner of the world. Yet, despite the accolades and opportunities that came his way, Marcus remained true to himself. He didn't move into a fancy apartment or buy expensive suits. Instead, he accepted modest housing provided by a veterans organization. It was simple, clean, and functional, everything he needed, and nothing more. Each morning, Marcus woke early, just as he had during his days in the military. He brewed a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the city wake up. Though his surroundings were different now, his routine stayed the same. He still visited the park occasionally, sitting on his bench and observing the ebb and flow of life. To him, it wasn't about escaping the past, but finding balance between who he used to be and who he had become. One of the most significant changes in Marcus's life was his decision to mentor young soldiers transitioning out of the military. At first, he was hesitant, unsure if he had anything valuable to offer. But after speaking at that veterans event, he realized how much his experiences could help others navigate their own struggles. He began volunteering at a local community center, leading workshops and offering one-on-one guidance. His approach was straightforward. No sugarcoating, no false promises, just honest advice rooted in empathy and understanding. Transitioning isn't easy, he would tell them during these sessions. You think you're leaving the hardest part behind, but sometimes the real challenge begins when you take off the uniform. People expect you to fit back into society like nothing happened, but inside, you're carrying weights they can't see. And that's okay. What matters is learning how to carry those weights without letting them crush you. His words resonated deeply with the participants, many of whom felt seen and understood for the first time. They admired Marcus not because of his legendary status as a sniper, but because of his humility and willingness to share his vulnerabilities. He became a trusted figure, someone they could turn to when the weight of civilian life felt unbearable. In addition to mentoring, Marcus also worked closely with advocacy groups to address issues facing homeless veterans. He traveled across the country, speaking at conferences and meeting with policymakers to push for better support systems. His efforts helped secure funding for transitional housing programs, job training initiatives, and mental health resources specifically tailored to veterans. Though he never sought recognition, his contributions earned him widespread respect, even admiration from those who once doubted him. Despite all this, Marcus never lost sight of what mattered most: staying grounded. He avoided the trappings of fame, refusing interviews or public appearances unless they aligned with his mission. When people thanked him for his service, he simply nodded and said, "I'm just doing my part." It was a phrase that summed up his entire philosophy: quiet, unassuming, yet profoundly impactful. As years passed, Marcus's influence continued to grow, though he preferred to work behind the scenes. He inspired countless individuals, not just veterans but ordinary citizens who saw in him a model of resilience and integrity. His story served as a reminder that heroism isn't about grand gestures or flashy achievements. It's about showing up, day after day, and making a difference in ways both big and small. On quiet evenings, Marcus often returned to the park where his journey had taken an unexpected turn. Sitting on his bench, he reflected on how far he'd come, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. The scars of his past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they fueled his drive to create a better future for others. And so, Marcus Kane continued living his life, not as a forgotten hero or a reluctant celebrity, but as a man who had reclaimed his purpose. In doing so, he proved that even in a world quick to overlook its quietest voices, true strength lies in the ability to rise above adversity and inspire others to do the same. For Marcus, the battle may have ended long ago, but his legacy was only beginning.